The morning of November 23, 1942, somewhere over occupied France, at 26,000 feet. Hauptmann Egon Meyer, commander of the 3rd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 2 Richthofen, rolled his Focke-Wulf 190 inverted and pulled through into a steep dive, watching the American bomber formation grow larger through his gun sight. His wingman, Georg Peter Eder, held position 200 meters to his right. Both men were seasoned combat veterans. Meyer had 21 confirmed kills. Eder would end the war with 78. They had shot down Spitfires, Hurricanes, and French fighters with relative ease over the past 3 years. These new American bombers couldn't be any different. They were wrong. What happened in the next 60 seconds would fundamentally alter Luftwaffe tactical doctrine and German fighter pilot psychology for the remainder of the war. Meyer's attack that morning would result in his first victory against a B-17 flying fortress. But the price of that knowledge, paid over the following 2 years in blood and burning aluminum, would teach every German fighter pilot in the West a lesson they wished they'd never learned. The Americans had built something unprecedented. Not just a bomber, but a flying weapons platform bristling with 1350 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each capable of firing 750 rounds per minute, creating an overlapping sphere of defensive fire so dense that attacking it required not just skill and courage, but a willingness to fly directly into what one Luftwaffe pilot would later describe as a wall of tracers coming from every direction. The flying fortress earned its name not through marketing hyperbole, but through the brutal mathematics of defensive firepower multiplied across dozens of aircraft flying in mutually supporting formations. In November 1942, as Meyer and Eder lined up their first attacks on American heavy bombers, the Luftwaffe was at the peak of its combat effectiveness. German fighter pilots were the most experienced in the world. Some had been flying combat since 1936 in Spain. By 1942, many carried victory totals that would seem impossible to later generations. 50 kills, 100 kills. Numbers that represented not just skill, but survival through thousands of hours of air combat across Poland, France, Britain, and the endless skies of Russia. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. These pilots approached the American bombers with confidence bordering on dismissiveness. German intelligence reports from early 1942 suggested the B-17E model carried 9 machine guns of 50 caliber. Impressive on paper, perhaps, but the Luftwaffe had destroyed thousands of Soviet bombers over the Eastern Front, many of them carrying similar defensive armament. British bombers, when caught by daylight fighters, died in flames despite their gun turrets and defensive positions. Why should American bombers prove any different? The assumption was reasonable based on existing combat data. A single fighter attacking a single bomber historically enjoyed significant advantages. The fighter possessed superior speed, allowing it to control engagement parameters. It carried forward-firing weapons aimed by pointing the entire aircraft, a system far more accurate than flexible guns operated by crew members working in cramped positions while wearing oxygen masks and heavy flight gear at 40 degrees below zero. The fighter pilot made split-second decisions with his full attention devoted to air combat, while bomber gunners divided their focus between multiple threats while also trying not to freeze to death in the thin air at operational altitude. August 17, 1942. The 8th Air Force flew its first heavy bomber mission from England, 12 B-17E. Flying fortresses from the 97th Bomb Group attacked the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in France. RAF Spitfires provided close escort. The mission succeeded with minimal opposition. 2 bombers sustained light flak damage. All aircraft returned safely. American commanders understood this, represented nothing close to what would be required. The real targets lay deep inside Germany, hundreds of miles beyond the range of any available escort fighter. The bombers would have to defend themselves. The B-17E carried 950 caliber Browning M2 machine guns distributed across 5 positions. 2 guns were mounted in the powered top turret located directly behind the cockpit, operated by the flight engineer. 2 more guns sat in the revolutionary Sperry Ball turret suspended beneath the fuselage, allowing the gunner to rotate 360 degrees while tracking targets from below. The tail gunner manned 2 guns in a manually operated position, providing rear defense. Additional guns were positioned in the radio operator's compartment and at 2 waist positions on either side of the rear fuselage. A single flexible gun in the nose provided limited forward defense. The Browning M2 weighed 64 pounds, measured 57 inches long, and fired 750 rounds per minute. Its effective range exceeded 3,500 feet, significantly longer than the German 20mm MGFF cannons initially used by Luftwaffe fighters. At typical combat ranges of 400 to 800 yards, the 50 caliber round delivered devastating kinetic energy, capable of penetrating armor plate, destroying engines, shattering canopies, and killing pilots. But individual weapons, statistics told only part of the story. The real transformation came from how American tactical doctrine employed these bombers. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 305th Bombardment Group, had spent the autumn of 1942 studying the problem of bomber vulnerability. LeMay was 36 years old, a navigator of legendary skill who had navigated B-17 seconds over 600 miles of open ocean to intercept the Italian liner Rex in May 1938, demonstrating both the bomber's capabilities and his own exceptional abilities. By 1942, he had developed clear operational principles. First, precision bombing required straight and level flight during the bomb run, regardless of enemy opposition. The Norden bombsight demanded stable flight to calculate release points. Second, tight formations were essential. Scattered bombers were vulnerable bombers. Only by flying close together could bombers mass their defensive armament to create overlapping fields of fire. Third, crews needed relentless training until every action became instinctive. LeMay drove his men hard and led by example, flying the most dangerous missions himself. His crews found him demanding, unemotional, and utterly focused on mission success. The existing 6-plane squadrons that flew the early missions were inadequate. At 2 to 4 miles separation, bombers under attack received no defensive fire support from other aircraft in their formation. The 50 caliber guns had an effective range of 3,500 feet, just over half a mile. The breakthrough came in December 1942 with what LeMay called the Javelin Down formation. 18 aircraft stacked both vertically and horizontally in a pattern resembling a spear point when viewed in profile. The formation consisted of 6 3-plane elements arranged in 3 squadrons. Each squadron had 2 elements. The squadrons were stacked vertically with the lead squadron in the middle, the high squadron above and to one side, and the low squadron below and to the other side. The key innovation involved stacking planes downward in the direction of the sun, aiding gunners on higher aircraft in seeing lower aircraft without glare, while simultaneously creating overlapping fields of fire covering every approach angle. The formation measured 600 feet high from lowest to highest bomber, 500 feet deep from front to back, nearly 2,500 feet across from one side to the other. Most importantly, every bomber in the formation could bring its guns to bear on an attacking fighter from almost any direction. On December 6, 1942, the 305th Bomb Group flew the Javelin Down formation for the first time in combat during a mission to Lille, France. 18 B-17Fs took off from RAF Chelveston, climbed to altitude, and formed up into the Javelin Down pattern. As they approached the target, German fighters made several passes but were unable to penetrate the concentrated defensive fire. The results were immediately apparent to both sides. German fighters approaching the formation found themselves facing concentrated defensive fire from multiple bombers simultaneously. The interlocking fields of fire created zones where attacking fighters were exposed to guns from 3 or 4 B-17 seconds at once. The formation worked so well that the other 3 B-17 groups in England immediately adopted it after mission debriefings revealed its effectiveness. But this was November 19, 1942. The tactics that would make daylight bombing possible were still being developed, and Egon Meyer was about to identify the flaw in the American defensive system. Meyer had analyzed British bomber formations during the previous 2 years of combat over France and the Channel. He understood that most defensive firepower faced rearward, the traditional direction of fighter attack. The nose of the B-17, where the bombardier and navigator worked in a plexiglass enclosure, was defended by only a single flexible 50 caliber machine gun with extremely limited fields of fire forward. Behind that plexiglass sat the cockpit, where pilot and co-pilot controlled the aircraft. A pilot killed at the controls meant the bomber would likely go down even if the rest of the crew survived. Mayer calculated that a head-on attack, though requiring exceptional skill and courage, would allow German fighters to concentrate fire on the bomber's most vulnerable spot. The tactic required attacking from 12 o'clock level, directly ahead of the bomber formation, flying straight toward the oncoming bombers at full throttle. The closing speed during a head-on attack was approximately 500 miles per hour. The B-17 cruised at about 180 miles per hour. A German Focke-Wulf 190 attacking at full speed approached at roughly 320 miles per hour. Combined, the closing speed reached 500 miles per hour, or about 730 feet per second. A German pilot had perhaps 3 seconds from the time he opened fire at maximum range until he had to break away to avoid collision. In those 3 seconds, a skilled pilot could rake the B-17's nose and cockpit with 20mm cannon fire, killing the pilot and co-pilot, destroying the flight controls, and turning a 4-engine bomber into falling wreckage. November 23, 1942. Mayer and Eder executed the first systematic head-on attacks on American heavy bombers. Mayer shot down 2 B-17 flying fortresses. Eder claimed a B-24 Liberator. The tactic worked spectacularly when properly executed. Within weeks, word spread through Luftwaffe fighter units across France and the Low Countries. By December 1942, the head-on attack had become the preferred method of engaging American heavy bombers among Luftwaffe fighter pilots. But what worked for elite pilots like Mayer and Eder proved extraordinarily difficult for pilots of average ability. The psychological pressure of watching a 4-engine bomber grow larger in the windscreen while tracer fire from the nose guns flashed past the canopy proved too much for many. They broke off too early, wasting their ammunition and exposing themselves to fire from the top turret as they passed overhead. Even successful frontal attacks often proved fatal for German pilots, despite destroying the bomber. The combined closing speed meant collision remained a constant danger, requiring precise timing and spatial judgment. Pilots who pressed attacks too aggressively, fixating on their target and forgetting to break away in time, sometimes couldn't pull out before their fighter struck the bomber they were attacking. Multiple Luftwaffe fighters collided with B-17 seconds during frontal passes, killing both crews instantly in the violent impact. January 27, 1943. The 8th Air Force flew its first mission against a target inside Germany proper, attacking the naval yards at Wilhelmshaven. 53 B-17 seconds and 20 B-24 seconds were dispatched. The 305th Bomb Group participated, flying in the combat box formation LeMay had developed. German fighters intercepted the formations and attacked with typical aggression, but the concentrated defensive fire from the tight formations forced them to break off attacks earlier and made accurate shooting far more difficult. 3 bombers were lost from the entire force, a loss rate of just over 4%, far below the 20% losses that would be sustained on later unescorted deep penetration missions. Luftwaffe pilots were genuinely confused about how to engage these heavily armed bombers effectively. One German pilot, Johannes Naumann, described a typical interception in the fall of 1942. His unit was ordered to attack bombers on their return flight, as there was no chance of reaching them on their bomb run. The B-17 seconds were flying in a staggered formation at about 26,000 feet. The Focke-Wulfs finally struggled up to 27,000 feet, only to see the American formation receding into the distance. The speed of the FW-190s at that altitude was only slightly greater than that of the bombers. No bombers were downed. None had even suffered visible damage. The frustration grew throughout early 1943. Attacking from the rear, the traditional German approach to bomber interception that had worked well against earlier Allied bombers with limited defensive armament, exposed the fighter pilot to the most concentrated defensive fire the B-17 could deliver. The tail gunner, enclosed in a powered Cheyenne turret with excellent visibility through clear plexiglass panels, commanded a clear field of fire directly aft with no blind spots above, below, or to either side, within 30 degrees of the tail axis. The dorsal turret, a Sperry design mounting 250 caliber guns in a powered rotating turret, could swing rearward to add its firepower to the defensive barrage, doubling the number of guns engaging a rear attacker. Even the waist gunners standing at open windows along the fuselage midsection could engage targets approaching from behind and slightly below or to the sides. A fighter pilot attacking from 6 o'clock directly behind the bomber faced at least 4 heavy machine guns concentrating fire along a predictable intercept path. The closing speed between attacking fighter and fleeing bomber, typically around 150 to 200 miles per hour differential, gave the German pilot perhaps 3 to 5 seconds of firing time before breaking away to avoid collision with the massive bomber. During those few seconds, the bomber's gunners poured hundreds of rounds into the approach corridor, creating a cone of fire that the fighter had to penetrate. Luftwaffe combat reports documented the deadly effectiveness of this defensive arrangement. Numerous fighters were damaged or destroyed during tail attacks. One Luftwaffe fighter ace, with 33 confirmed victories flying with Jagdgeschwader 11, described the experience in his combat diary. Attacking the American bombers is like flying into a wall of fire. The tracers come from every direction. You pick your target, line up for the attack, and suddenly the air around you fills with red tracers. You fire your guns, try to get hits on the bomber, and then you dive away praying that nothing vital was hit. After examining wrecked B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, Luftwaffe officers discovered that bringing down a heavy bomber from the rear required approximately 20 hits with 20mm cannon shells. Analysis of combat footage using gun cameras showed that pilots of average ability hit bombers with only about 2% of the rounds they fired when attacking from the rear. The mathematics were brutal. To achieve 20 hits, an average pilot needed to fire 1,020mm rounds, but the early Focke-Wulf 190 carried only 500 rounds of 20mm ammunition total. Even expending all ammunition provided only 10 hits on average, not enough to guarantee a kill. The solution was heavier weapons. Later versions of the FW-190 carried 4 or even 6 MG-151 20mm cannons plus twin MG-131 13mm heavy machine guns. Some aircraft were fitted with experimental heavy cannons. The BK-37 was a 37mm automatic cannon. The Mk-103 was a 30mm cannon. Some specialized bomber-destroyer aircraft carried even larger weapons. These massive weapons could destroy a bomber with 1 or 2 hits, but they were difficult to aim. Heavy, reduced aircraft performance, and had very limited ammunition. Major Anton Haeckel, who ended the war with 192 confirmed victories, explained the tactical problem. If one came in from the rear, there was a long period closing from 1,000 meters to our firing range of 400 meters when the bombers were firing at us, but we could not effectively return fire. The 50 caliber guns on the bombers had longer range than our guns. Attacking from the front was better because the closing speed was so high that we were in their firing zone for less time. But the front attacks required much more skill and nerve. Spring 1943. The 8th Air Force expanded operations. More bomb groups arrived in England. Mission sizes grew from dozens of bombers to hundreds. The basic group formation of 18 to 21 planes was expanded to create combat wing formations. 3 groups flying together as a wing, stacked vertically and horizontally, created a 54-plane formation that could project truly massive defensive firepower. This wing box became standard for major missions. The groups were positioned with a lead group in the center, a high group above and to one side, and a low group below and to the other side. The wing box occupied a volume of airspace roughly 3,000 feet high, 7,000 feet deep, and 2,000 feet across. The 54-plane combat wing, when fully equipped with B-17Gs, was capable of fielding upwards of 700 heavy-caliber defensive machine guns. 54 bombers, each carrying 13 guns, equaled 702 heavy machine guns total. A Luftwaffe pilot attacking such a formation faced the reality that dozens of gunners were tracking him visually through their sights, and hundreds of bullets were converging on his flight path. The tracer rounds, every 5th round in the belt, created visible streams of fire. From a distance, the formations looked like porcupines with dozens of fiery quills extending in all directions. German fighter pilots began calling the B-17 combat box formations Fliegende Stachelschwein, flying porcupine, a term that perfectly captured the visual impression and tactical reality of attacking massed bombers. Oberleutnant Heinz Noack, a Luftwaffe fighter ace with 33 confirmed victories, described attacking a combat box as flying into a wall of fire where tracers come from every direction. Summer 1943. The B-17G model began entering service. This definitive version of the Flying Fortress carried 1350 caliber machine guns, the most heavily armed bomber in American service. The armament was distributed across 5 powered turrets and 4 manual positions. 2 guns in the Bendix chin turret defended against head-on attacks, directly addressing the vulnerability Egon Meyer had exploited. 2 cheek guns in manual ball socket mounts on either side of the nose provided additional forward coverage. 2 guns in the dorsal turret, located just after the cockpit, operated by the flight engineer, covered attacks from above and to the sides. 2 guns in the Sperry ball turret mounted in the belly defended against attacks from below. 2 guns in manual waist positions, one on each side of the rear fuselage, covered the beam positions. 1 flexible gun in the radio operator's compartment provided additional coverage from above and rear. 2 guns in the tail turret provided critical rear defense with the longest effective killing zone, extending roughly 1,000 yards directly behind the bomber. The B-17G finally provided comprehensive defensive coverage from every angle. A crew of 10 operated the aircraft, each man trained for specific duties but cross-trained on multiple positions. The physical demands on B-17 gunners were extraordinary and must be understood to appreciate their combat effectiveness. The ball turret gunner, typically the smallest crew member, entered his position through a hatch in the fuselage floor, then spent the entire mission crouched in a fetal position in a space measuring approximately 4 feet in diameter, unable to wear a parachute due to space constraints. If the aircraft was hit and going down, he had to rotate his turret to align the hatch with the fuselage opening, exit into the aircraft, retrieve his parachute, and then bail out, all while the bomber was potentially spinning or on fire. The waist gunners stood at open windows where temperatures at altitude reached 40 degrees below zero, and wind speeds of 150 miles per hour roared through the fuselage. They wore electrically heated suits that frequently malfunctioned. Frostbite was common. Flying a B-17 inches combat formation demanded constant attention and significant physical strength. The pilot had to maintain precise airspeed, altitude, and position relative to other aircraft while wearing heavy clothing, oxygen mask, and flight gear at altitudes where temperatures reached 40 below zero. The turbulence from prop wash of leading bombers made formation flying even more difficult. Each B-17's 4 engines created massive vortices of disturbed air, extending back hundreds of feet behind each bomber. Aircraft flying in trail or in lower positions encountered constant turbulence. The B-17's control system was not power-assisted. Moving the control yoke, rudder pedals and throttles required physical force. After 6 hours in formation at altitude, pilots' arms felt like concrete. The discipline required to maintain formation was extraordinary. A 1943 Army Air Forces survey found that just over half of all B-17 seconds shot down by Germans during attacks on European targets were aircraft that had left the main formation. Aircraft that fell out of formation due to battle damage, mechanical failure, or crew errors were quickly swarmed by German fighters. Once separated from the formation's protective firepower, a bomber typically survived less than 5 minutes before being shot down. Conversely, bombers that maintained formation discipline and stayed in their assigned positions had dramatically higher survival rates. The defensive fire forced German pilots to break off attacks sooner, made accurate gunnery difficult, and occasionally shot them down. But the Germans were adapting. The Luftwaffe also experimented with standoff weapons. The Werfer Granit 21 was a 21-centimeter rocket carried in simple tube launchers mounted under the wings. These unguided projectiles packed massive explosive power. A direct hit would destroy a B-17. But the rockets were difficult to use. They had terrible ballistic properties and no guidance system. Pilots had to fire at ranges of 800 to 1,000 yards, outside the effective range of bomber defensive guns. Hit rates were extremely low, but the rockets were effective psychological weapons. Seeing large rockets trailing smoke flying toward the formation caused bomber pilots to take evasive action, breaking up the tight formations and disrupting the bomb run. August 17, 1943. Exactly 1 year after the 8th Air Force's first mission. 376 B-17 seconds launched a double strike mission against the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. This was the largest and most ambitious American bombing operation attempted to that date. Curtis LeMay, now commanding the 3rd Air Division, would personally lead the Regensburg mission. The Regensburg force, consisting of 146 B-17 bombers from 7 bomb groups, would strike first, then continue south across the Alps to bases in North Africa. The Schweinfurt force, consisting of 230 B-17 bombers from 9 groups, would follow and return to England. The mission began badly. Dense fog covered English airfields. Weather delays forced a 3-hour gap between the two strikes instead of the planned 30 minutes. This destroyed the entire tactical plan. German radar tracked both formations from takeoff. The long delay gave German fighter controllers time to land, rearm, refuel, and attack both formations. The Regensburg force encountered German fighters almost immediately after crossing the Dutch coast. Messerschmitts 109s and Focke-Wulfs 190s attacked in waves. The head-on attacks came first with 3 and 4 fighters abreast, boring straight at the lead bombers. Some German pilots were so skilled and so aggressive that they held their fire until 300 yards or closer, ensuring maximum effect before executing violent breakaway maneuvers. The Luftwaffe had learned from 6 months of experience fighting American bomber formations. They focused attacks on individual groups, overwhelming local defensive capabilities. Damaged bombers that fell out of formation were immediately swarmed. The German pilots flew from home bases in Germany, many within 50 miles of the bomber route. After expending ammunition, they would land, be rearmed and refueled in 15 to 20 minutes, and take off again to attack the same bomber stream a second or even third time. Despite the ferocious attacks, the formations pressed on. At Regensburg, the bombing was accurate, and the Messerschmitt factory was hit hard. But the price was high. 24 B-17 seconds were shot down. The Schweinfurt force fared even worse. Delayed by hours, they faced German fighters that had already attacked the Regensburg force, returned to base, rearmed, and taken off again. The Schweinfurt force lost 36 B-17 seconds out of 183 that reached the target. Combined losses for the day were 60 bombers and approximately 600 crewmen, a loss rate of 20%. Despite the losses, the combat box formations performed exactly as designed. A post-mission survey by the United States Army Air Forces analyzed loss patterns and found that over half the bombers shot down had left the protection of the main formation. Bombers that maintained formation discipline and stayed in their assigned positions had dramatically higher survival rates. The concentrated defensive fire had shot down some German fighters, damaged many others, and most importantly forced German pilots to break off their attacks earlier. Without the combat box, losses would have been even higher. The formation had done its job. It just wasn't enough without fighter escort. But this mission revealed something else to German fighter pilots who had initially dismissed American bombers as easy targets. The reality of attacking these formations was nothing like what they had expected. Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful fighter aces, with over 200 victories including 15 during the Battle of Britain and nearly 180 on the Eastern Front, returned to the Western Front in 1943 to take command of Jagdgeschwader 1. In October 1943, with his total score now over 200, he wrote a letter to a former Eastern Front comrade describing how tough the fighting was against American bombers. Against 20 Russians trying to shoot you down, or even 20 Spitfires, it can be exciting, even fun. But curve in towards 40 fortresses and all your past sins flash before your eyes. 4 days later, Hans Philipp was dead, shot down, it's believed, by 56th Fighter Group ace Robert Johnson shortly after shooting down his first and only 4-engine bomber. The laughter had stopped. September 6, 1943, 338 flying fortresses set out for Stuttgart, Germany. The Bosch factory located there was the target. Stuttgart was at the very limit of the B-17's range in 1943, and fuel was a precious commodity. As usual, as the fortresses approached German territory, German fighters attacked. The assaults were violent head-on passes that resulted in high casualties among the lead crews. Yet despite the opposition, the bombers continued toward the Bosch factory. Once over the target, however, the mission began to unravel. A cloud front had unexpectedly moved in, obscuring the view from the bombardiers perched in the noses of their B-17 seconds 25,000 feet above. General Robert Travis, aerial commander of the mission, made the decision to circle the target and wait for the clouds to move. As the bomber formation circled, the target, the tight combat boxes of B-17 seconds, became easy targets for enemy fighters. 3 passes were made and the clouds had not broken, all while precious fuel was being burned and B-17 seconds were being shot down by fighters and anti-aircraft artillery. The B-17 seconds had been over the target for nearly 30 minutes when the bombs in the lead aircraft finally dropped. The bombs missed the target almost completely. 45 B-17 seconds failed to return to England that night. A survivor of the Stuttgart mission recalled the growing sense of futility. We began to wonder if they were trying to kill all of us. There were fewer and fewer guys returning every day. One of the many who didn't return from Stuttgart added, "We felt as if they didn't know what the hell they were doing up there, especially over Stuttgart. They were just aimlessly flying around." The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, had refined their tactics throughout early 1943. Fighter units would position themselves ahead of the bomber stream, then set up their attack runs. They attacked in waves of 3 or 4 aircraft abreast, the Ket formation, flying straight at the lead bomber formation. At 1,000 yards range, they opened fire with their 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns. The Focke-Wulf 190 fighters carried 4 MG-151 20mm cannons plus 2 MG-17 machine guns in the later models. At 500 yards, the German pilots would fire a final burst and then execute violent breakaway maneuvers. But even as German tactics improved, even as pilots like Egon Meyer became expert at exploiting the B-17's vulnerabilities, the sheer volume of defensive fire from massed formations made every attack a calculated risk with death. The statistical reality facing German fighter pilots grew more daunting with each passing month. By spring 1943, there were now some 600 B-17Fs in Britain. Mission sizes reached 100 to 200 bombers regularly. Each bomber carried 9 to 13 heavy machine guns. The mathematics were inescapable. A typical combat wing of 54 bombers fielded between 500 and 700 heavy machine guns, creating interlocking fields of fire. At typical combat ranges of 400 to 800 yards, every bomber gunner who detected an attacking fighter opened fire simultaneously. The psychological impact overwhelmed many pilots regardless of actual hit probability. Luftwaffe after-action reports documented numerous instances of fighters breaking off attacks prematurely before reaching optimal firing range because pilots couldn't force themselves to fly deeper into the defensive. Barrage. Those pilots who maintained discipline and pressed attacks home despite the defensive fire faced brutal arithmetic that favored the defenders. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. One Luftwaffe pilot said that trying to attack a B-17 formation from behind was like trying to make love to a porcupine that is on fire. The imagery was vivid and accurate. The size of the heavy bombers and their formations could not be adequately described to a green pilot. They had to be experienced firsthand. The bomber gunners opened fire as soon as a target was seen. According to legendary German ace General Adolf Galland, one key to success against United States Army Air Force's bombers was for the fighters to maintain formation themselves. Although the bombers' guns did not bring down many German fighters, their streams of 50 caliber tracers did in fact form an extremely effective defensive shield. The Luftwaffe response was to increase firepower and develop new tactics. Examination of wrecked B-17 seconds revealed specific vulnerabilities, but exploiting those vulnerabilities required getting close enough to the bombers to deliver accurate fire, and that meant flying through the defensive barrage. Later versions of the Focke-Wulf 190 were designated as Sturmbock, assault ram, variants. These heavily armed and armored bomber destroyers carried 4 20mm cannons, plus additional armor plating to protect the pilot. The concept was simple: accept that you will be hit by defensive fire. Armor yourself sufficiently to survive long enough to close to point-blank range where your cannons cannot miss. The Sturmbock pilots were among the bravest men in the Luftwaffe. They would form up in groups of 20 to 30 aircraft, often escorted by lighter fighters, tasked with keeping American escort fighters away, and drive straight into the bomber formations. Their orders were to close to within 100 yards before firing, a range where even average pilots could hardly miss, but where the defensive fire from dozens of bombers converged on each attacking fighter with devastating effect. Some Sturmbock pilots achieved remarkable success. Others died on their first mission, their armored fighters absorbing dozens of 50-caliber rounds before critical hits to the engine or fuel system sent them spiraling down. October 8, 1943. 389 American B-17 and B-24 bombers, escorted by 274 P-47 fighters, attacked Bremen. German fighters pressed their attacks with unprecedented aggression. On this mission, the enemy fighters did not peel away when approaching the flak field. They remained in attack mode over the flak field and flew through their own anti-aircraft fire in order to deliver their assaults. As they approached the initial point, the fighters pressed even closer. One survivor remembered seeing a flight of FW-190s barreling into their squadron, aiming right at them. Kept coming, kept coming. They may have killed the pilot of the lead ship, or else he was so determined that he was going to take down a bomber that he flew directly into the ship and witness was formed on. When they went down, the witness had to dump his nose to keep them from taking him with them. 31 bombers were lost. The next day, 368 bombers set out on the deepest penetration yet, hitting Danzig, Gdynia, and other sites along the Baltic coast. 28 bombers were lost. On October 10th, a group of 313 bombers took off to attack Münster, with the resulting loss of 30 planes. Bomber losses during these actions were in each case less than 10% of the force committed, a rate considered acceptable in this campaign of attrition. But for the crews flying these missions, the mathematics of survival were becoming increasingly grim. John Luckadoo, a pilot in the 100th Bomb Group, calculated a 400% turnover in the first 90 days of combat. In 1943, bomber crews were tasked with a 25-mission tour of duty. Most crews never made it past their 5th mission. The Luftwaffe owned the skies over Europe, and the men of the 8th Air Force were paying the price. A fatalistic sense of acceptance became prevalent. A popular saying at the time was that to fly in the 8th Air Force then was like holding a ticket to a funeral, your own. The stage was set for the next deep penetration attack. October 14, 1943, Schweinfurt. This mission would become known as Black Thursday, the bloodiest day in 8th Air Force history. 291 B-17 seconds took off that morning from bases across East Anglia. Weather was miserable. Assembly into formation took longer than planned. The mission was nearly scrubbed, but commanders decided to proceed. The strategic importance of Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production justified the risk. Only about half the expected P-47 escort fighters were able to rendezvous with the bomber formations. As the B-17 seconds in their combat box formations approached Aachen on the German-Belgian border, the Thunderbolts waggled their wings in the traditional farewell gesture and turned for home, their fuel exhausted. The bombers continued alone into Germany. Then the Luftwaffe struck with unprecedented force. German fighter controllers had tracked the formations from takeoff. Every available fighter unit in Western Germany was scrambled. Over 300 German fighters attacked the bomber stream in coordinated waves. Single-engine Messerschmitts 109s and Focke-Wulfs 190s came in 3 and 4 abreast, attacking head-on. The attacks were pressed home with tremendous aggression. They were followed by twin-engine fighters firing Werfer Granit 21 rockets from 1,000 yards out. The massive rockets forced formations to scatter as individual B-17 seconds took evasive action. This broke up the combat boxes and ruined the mutually supporting defensive fire. The Luftwaffe had learned from experience and refined their tactics specifically to break up the combat box. They focused attacks on individual groups, overwhelming local defensive capabilities. Damaged bombers that fell out of formation were immediately swarmed by German fighters. By the time the formations reached Schweinfurt, 28 bombers had already been lost. The 305th Bomb Group, LeMay's old unit, was hit particularly hard. Flying in the most exposed low-group position, they bore the brunt of repeated attacks. 13 aircraft from the 305th failed to return to England, the highest loss of any group on the mission. 130 men from the 305th were killed, captured, or listed as missing. The bombing was accurate despite the chaos. Post-strike reconnaissance photographs showed severe damage to several production facilities, but the cost was beyond anything previously experienced. Of the 291 B-17 seconds that departed England that morning, 60 were shot down by fighters or flak. Another 17 returned to England so heavily damaged that they had to be scrapped. Another 121 aircraft landed with varying degrees of battle damage. Total losses represented over 26% of the attacking force. Aircrew casualties were equally severe. 650 men were lost out of 2,900 who flew the mission, representing 22% of all crews. At that loss rate, an aircrew member had virtually no chance of surviving a 25-mission tour. Staff Sergeant Harold Monroe Graham, bold turret gunner with the 305th Bomb Group, had flown 27 missions successfully. The night before Black Thursday, Graham wrote a letter home that his family preserved. "We all know what we're facing tomorrow. Schweinfurt is the toughest target in Germany, but the formation will protect us as much as anything can. If we stay together, if we hold the box no matter what happens, some of us will make it through. The formation gives us that chance." Graham's aircraft was shot down over Schweinfurt the next day. His bomber took several direct hits, caught fire, and went into a spin. Only 3 parachutes were seen leaving the aircraft. Graham was not among the survivors. He was 22 years old. The immediate aftermath of Black Thursday forced a fundamental reassessment of American daylight bombing doctrine. The loss rates were simply too high. Crews could not be expected to survive 25 mission tours when each mission had a 20% casualty rate. For the rest of 1943, the 8th Air Force limited its operations to targets within range of fighter escorts. Deep penetration missions to targets in central and southern Germany were suspended indefinitely. But this was not a defeat. Rather, a necessary operational pause while solutions were implemented. For the Luftwaffe pilots, who had initially laughed at the idea of heavily armed American bombers being a serious threat, the laughter had long since died. What replaced it was something more complex: respect for an enemy who kept coming despite horrific losses, fear of the wall of defensive fire that turned every attack into a gamble with death, and a growing realization that even when they achieved favorable loss ratios, shooting down 2 or 3 bombers for every fighter lost, the Americans could sustain such attrition indefinitely, while German fighter forces could not. Egon Meyer, the man who had pioneered the head-on attack and who would be credited with 27 4-engine bomber kills by the time of his death, understood the strategic reality better than most. He had achieved success against the flying fortresses. He had developed tactics that worked. He had trained other pilots in those methods. But success on an individual level didn't change the fundamental arithmetic of the air war. By late 1943, the North American P-51B Mustang was entering service with the 8th Air Force. Powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and equipped with external drop tanks, the P-51B had a combat radius of over 650 miles, enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Mustang combined this extraordinary range with excellent performance. At 30,000 feet altitude, where bombers and German fighters operated, the P-51B could match or exceed the performance of Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. When P-51-equipped fighter groups began escorting bomber missions in February 1944, the strategic balance shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The combat box formations continued in use throughout the war, but their role evolved. With effective fighter escorts available, the rigid defensive formations became less critical for pure survival. Instead, they became more important for bombing accuracy. The tight formations ensured concentrated bomb patterns on target, maximizing damage. As the Luftwaffe fighter threat diminished progressively through 1944, flak became the primary danger. But the defensive firepower that had so impressed and terrified German fighter pilots remained a constant factor in aerial combat over Europe. February 1944. When the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt during the big week missions, everything had changed. Long-range P-51 Mustangs escorted the bombers all the way to the target and back. The B-17G, with its 13 machine guns, provided comprehensive defensive coverage. The combat box formations had been refined through 2 years of combat experience. And most importantly, the Luftwaffe was beginning to collapse under sustained attrition. German fighter losses were mounting at unsustainable rates. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The strategic air campaign that had seemed on the verge of failure in October 1943 was now succeeding. Egon Meyer would not live to see the final outcome. On March 2, 1944, he led a formation from Jagdgeschwader 2 against a United States Army Air Force's daylight raid. P-47 fighters escorted the bombers. The fighter escort overpowered Meyer's attacking group and he was shot down and killed near Montmedy while flying his Focke-Wulf 190A6. He was posthumously awarded the swords to his Knight's Cross. His final score stood at 102 confirmed victories, including 27 four-engine bombers, all achieved on the Western Front. Meyer had been the first to systematically exploit the B-17's forward vulnerability. He had developed tactics that achieved remarkable success when executed by skilled pilots. He had proven that the flying fortress could be shot down despite its formidable defensive armament. But in doing so, he had also proven something the Luftwaffe didn't want to admit. Even with superior tactics, even with experienced pilots, even with heavy weapons specifically designed to destroy bombers, the defensive firepower of massed B-17 formations was so intense that attacking them remained extraordinarily dangerous. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, Allied air forces had achieved complete air supremacy over Europe. German fighters had been largely swept from the skies through systematic attrition. Bomber formations could operate with relative impunity over most of Germany. Loss rates dropped from 20% in October 1943 to 3 to 5% by mid-1944, levels that were sustainable. Crews' chances of completing 25 mission tours improved dramatically. The psychological impact was enormous. New crews arriving in theater could look at veterans who had completed tours and know that survival was possible. The effectiveness of the combat box is demonstrated by comprehensive survival statistics. Of the 12,731 B-17 seconds built during the entire war, 4,735 were lost in combat operations, representing a loss rate of 37%. But detailed analysis shows clearly that bombers maintaining formation discipline in combat boxes had survival rates significantly higher than the overall average, while those that became separated had survival rates far below average. A bomber that fell out of formation had perhaps a 20% chance of reaching friendly territory. Most were shot down within minutes. Conversely, a bomber that maintained its position had better than 50% chance of survival, even on heavily opposed missions. The difference between life and death was often nothing more than holding position in the combat box. Technical Sergeant Albert Brown, radio operator flying with the 305th Bomb Group, wrote in a letter home that was later donated to the National Air Force Museum, "The formation is everything. You see a bomber fall out and you know he's done for. The fighters swarm him like sharks around blood in the water. But if you stay in the box, if you hold your position no matter what, the other bombers protect you with their guns and you protect them with yours. It's the only way any of us survive. We depend on each other absolutely. That's what gets you through, knowing you're not alone, that if you do your job and stay in position, the formation will protect you as much as anything can in this war." The costs were horrific and must be acknowledged honestly. The 8th Air Force suffered 54,000 casualties during the combined bomber offensive, with 26,000 killed in action and 28,000 taken prisoner. To put this in perspective, the 8th Air Force casualties exceeded the entire Marine Corps casualties in the Pacific Theater. The peak losses came during the second half of 1943, when deep penetration missions without adequate fighter escort led to unsustainable loss rates. The courage required to climb into a bomber knowing the odds were against survival, to fly through flak and fighter attacks, to stay in formation when every instinct screamed to break away, cannot be overstated. But what about the German pilots who had initially dismissed these bombers as just another target? What happened to their confidence? The transformation was profound and tragic. Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe ace who survived the war with 176 victories, later wrote about the psychological impact of fighting against American bomber formations. "In the beginning, we thought we could stop them. We had the best pilots in the world, we had excellent aircraft, we had proven tactics, but we didn't understand what we were facing. It wasn't just the guns, though God knows there were enough of those. It was the industrial capacity behind those guns. For every bomber we shot down, 2 more appeared the next week. For every pilot we killed, 3 new crews arrived from America. They could afford to lose 20% of their force on a mission and still come back the next day with the same numbers. We couldn't. Every pilot we lost was irreplaceable. Every fighter destroyed took weeks to replace, if we could replace it at all. By 1944, the average life expectancy for a German day fighter pilot was measured in weeks rather than months. Many never achieved 10 combat missions before being killed or too badly wounded to continue flying. The downward spiral of declining experience levels accelerated throughout the final year of the war. Meanwhile, the Americans implemented systematic crew rotation policies that sent crews home after completing tour requirements. Survivors returned to training commands in the United States, where they passed hard-won combat experience to new crews, creating institutional learning that preserved lessons purchased with blood. This systematic approach to crew utilization contrasted sharply with German practice of flying pilots until they died, were captured, or became physically unable to continue due to wounds or exhaustion. The different philosophies reflected different industrial realities and strategic positions. America could afford to rotate experienced crews to training roles because production provided steady streams of replacement aircraft and new crews fresh from training. Germany couldn't spare anyone with combat experience. Every pilot capable of flying combat missions stayed on the line until killed, captured, or incapacitated. The statistical reality of the combat box remained stark and undeniable throughout the war. A 54-plane combat wing of B-17Gs fielded over 700 heavy machine guns, each capable of firing 750 rounds per minute with an effective range of 3,500 feet. These guns were arranged in three-dimensional space to create overlapping fields of fire covering every possible approach angle. Any fighter attempting to attack the formation had to fly through this wall of defensive fire for several seconds. Luftwaffe analysis confirmed that German pilots found attacking intact formations extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The defensive fire forced early breakaways, made accurate gunnery nearly impossible, and occasionally shot them down. But perhaps most importantly, it created a psychological barrier that affected pilot performance even before shots were fired. Young German pilots, fresh from training with perhaps 50 hours of flight time, were expected to press attacks against formations defended by hundreds of heavy machine guns operated by crews who had survived dozens of missions. The psychological pressure broke many before they ever fired their guns. Some froze, some broke off attacks prematurely, wasting ammunition. Some simply refused to press attacks home, circling at a safe distance until they could claim they had attacked without actually closing to effective range. Veteran pilots like Hans Philipp, who had found air combat exciting and even fun when fighting against Soviet or British aircraft, discovered that attacking American bomber formations was something entirely different. His letter describing how all your past sins flash before your eyes when curving in towards 40 fortresses captured the psychological reality that no amount of training could prepare pilots for. 4 days after writing that letter, Philipp was dead. The 13 machine guns that armed each B-17G were not just defensive weapons. They were force multipliers that transformed individual bombers into mutually supporting weapons platforms. They were psychological weapons that affected enemy pilot behavior even when hit probabilities remained relatively low. They were symbols of American industrial capacity and organizational ability to build, arm, and deploy thousands of heavy bombers while simultaneously prosecuting a global war on multiple fronts. The development of the combat box also represented a uniquely American approach to warfare that combined engineering, industrial capacity, and tactical innovation. Where other nations might have abandoned daylight bombing after discovering its costs, the Americans engineered a solution. They analyzed the problem systematically, studied loss patterns, experimented with different formations, and refined tactics based on combat results. The solution required massive industrial capacity to build thousands of heavy bombers, each carrying 13 heavy machine guns and 7,500 rounds of ammunition. Building 12,000 B-17 seconds required millions of man-hours and coordination across dozens of states. The solution also required training infrastructure to teach tens of thousands of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners to operate as coordinated teams. The logistics of training, transporting, and integrating these crews into combat operations represented an organizational challenge as demanding as the combat itself. The combat box was not just a tactical formation, but a manifestation of American organizational capability and industrial power. It represented using technological superiority and organizational skill to overcome tactical challenges. The Germans had better trained pilots initially and the advantage of fighting over their own territory, but they could not match American industrial production or organizational ability to coordinate mass operations. The combat box symbolized this advantage. Only a nation with the industrial capacity to build thousands of heavy bombers and the organizational capability to coordinate mass formations could execute this strategy. By the time the war ended in May 1945, less than 3 years after Curtis LeMay first tested the formation over Lille on December 6, 1942, the combat box had become the standard by which all bomber formations were judged. Over 12,000 B-17 seconds flew combat missions using variations of the combat box formation. They dropped over 640,000 tons of bombs on German targets, destroying factories, oil refineries, transportation networks, and military installations. They forced the Luftwaffe into a war of attrition it could not win. And they demonstrated conclusively that with proper tactics, adequate armament, and extraordinary crew skill, daylight strategic bombing could succeed even against the most determined opposition. The men who flew in those formations understood exactly what they were doing and accepted the risks knowingly. They knew the statistics. Intelligence officers briefed them on loss rates before missions. They could count empty beds in their barracks. They attended memorial services for friends. They knew that completing a 25-mission tour required not just skill and courage, but enormous luck. The pre-mission rituals reflected this knowledge. Some men wrote letters to be mailed home if they didn't return. Others prayed. Some carried lucky charms. They put on their gear methodically, checked their equipment carefully, and walked to their aircraft with the quiet determination of men doing a job that had to be done regardless of cost. The historical significance of the combat box lies not just in its tactical effectiveness, but in what it represented about American air power doctrine. The Army Air Forces had committed to daylight precision bombing over heavily defended targets, a strategy that seemed suicidal when the Royal Air Force had already abandoned daylight bombing due to prohibitive losses. The Americans refused to abandon the concept. They believed destroying specific industrial targets was essential to winning the war, and that only daylight bombing could provide the necessary accuracy. The combat box was the solution that made daylight precision bombing viable by concentrating defensive firepower to levels that German fighters could not easily overwhelm. The formations required extraordinary crew skill, physical stamina, and courage. Flying in tight combat box formation for 8 to 10 hours at altitude in sub-zero temperatures while being attacked by fighters and surrounded by flak bursts tested men to their absolute limits. Yet thousands of crews did this repeatedly, completing 25 or more missions. Many continued flying even after completing their required tours. The sense of mission, the belief that they were helping win the war and save lives by shortening the conflict, sustained them through experiences that would have broken lesser men. In the history of aerial warfare, few tactical innovations have had greater impact or required greater courage from the men who executed them. The combat box stands as testament to both American ingenuity and the extraordinary bravery of young men who flew tight formation through walls of fire above Hitler's Europe. These men, average age 23, many fresh from farms and small towns across America, climbed into their bombers day after day and faced odds that would have broken professional soldiers. They did this because they believed in their mission, that they were fighting to end tyranny, to defend freedom, to protect their families. This belief sustained them through experiences that left psychological scars many carried for the rest of their lives. For the Luftwaffe aces who had laughed at the B-17, who had dismissed American bombers as just another target to be destroyed with relative ease, the reality proved far different. The 13 machine guns didn't just defend individual bombers. They created a defensive system that, when multiplied across dozens of aircraft in tight formation, transformed the sky into a killing zone where even the best German pilots faced odds that no amount of skill could overcome. Egon Meyer learned this truth firsthand. He developed tactics that worked. He shot down 27 four-engine bombers. He trained other pilots in his methods. He became one of the most successful bomber-destroyers in the Luftwaffe. But in the end, even his skill and courage weren't enough. The P-47 that shot him down on March 2, 1944, was itself protecting a bomber formation. The circle was complete. The Americans had solved the problem of daylight strategic bombing not through a single innovation, but through a combination of defensive firepower, tactical formations, and long-range fighter escorts working together as a system. The laughter that had greeted the first appearance of American bombers over Europe in August 1942 had long since died by March 1944. What replaced it was a grim understanding among surviving German fighter pilots. These bombers were not easy targets. These formations were not vulnerable to traditional fighter tactics. These crews were not going to turn back no matter how many of their comrades fell in flames. The 13 machine guns on each B-17G, multiplied across hundreds of bombers flying in combat box formations, had created a defensive capability that fundamentally altered the balance of air power over Europe. The Germans could still shoot down individual bombers. Skilled pilots could still achieve victories, but they could not stop the bombing campaign. They could not prevent the systematic destruction of German industry. They could not maintain the rate of fighter production necessary to replace losses, and they could not train replacement pilots fast enough to offset the steady attrition of combat. By the summer of 1944, the question was no longer whether Germany could win the air war over Europe. The question became how long German forces could continue fighting against increasingly overwhelming material disadvantage before collapse became inevitable. The combat box formations represent what ordinary Americans can accomplish when called upon to do extraordinary things. And they remain one of the most remarkable tactical innovations in modern military history, accomplished not through force alone but through the combination of American and industrial might, organizational genius, and the raw courage of young men who refused to accept defeat. The 13 machine guns that armed each flying fortress told only part of the story. The complete story involved thousands of bombers, tens of thousands of crew members, millions of rounds of ammunition, and a level of organizational coordination that transformed individual weapons into a strategic system capable of achieving objectives that seemed impossible in 1942. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.